I killed my reborn baby. Strong, right? It hits you in the gut the moment you hear it. You're probably thinking, what? Why? Who would do such a thing? But before jumping to conclusions, I want you to listen to this story. Because what sounds strange at first might be exactly what you needed to hear today. This isn't just another story about loneliness or neediness. It's about rediscovery, about the kind of affection no one teaches us to deal with, about the real woman behind the silence, the one who spent her life taking care of everyone else and forgot about herself. Until a doll, yes, a doll, woke up inside her what the whole world had put to sleep: love, desire, and the courage to try again. This video isn't for everyone. It's for those who have felt invisible, who carry quiet pain, who've cried over things others said made no sense. It's a story that will move you, because it speaks to feminine emotions that few have the courage to put into words. And once you hear it, you feel it. And look, I'm going to tell you everything, absolutely everything. No filters, no sugarcoating, no censorship. Because this story isn't just mine. It might be yours too. It's the kind of honest confession you rarely hear out there, and maybe it will change how you see yourself from now on. This video will stir something in you, so go ahead and like, share, and subscribe to the channel, because what comes next, you won't want to miss. No one wakes up on an ordinary day and says, "Today I'm going to kill my reborn baby." But that's exactly what Sarah, a 54-year-old woman, did. Not with violence, of course, but with a kind of farewell that only someone who has had emotional attachment to something symbolic can truly understand. It's just a doll, someone from the outside might say. But it wasn't. It was more than plastic, paint, and weight. It was a mirror of emotions she didn't even know were there. You might think it's an exaggeration, but when we hear a phrase like that, "I killed my reborn baby," the first instinct is to judge. Yet behind those words lies a powerful narrative, a story of a real woman, the kind you don't see on social media with filters and polished captions. This is one of those stories that lays bare the emotional world most prefer to hide. A story that will touch you, and one you've likely never heard before. Sarah wasn't trying to go viral or get attention. She wanted silence. She wanted to understand why something so simple, a realistic reborn doll, could awaken feelings in her that no flesh and blood relationship ever had. And in that silence began a process of emotional reconstruction, with every stage you can imagine: pain, denial, attachment, emotional farewell, inner healing, and finally, a kind of emotional rebirth. That reborn baby was the trigger, the comfort object, the unprescribed therapy that worked as if it had been tailor-made. Sarah held that doll as if it carried a piece of herself that had been denied for years. Not out of selfishness, but for survival. And when she finally decided to kill that symbolic baby, she was burying much more than a toy. She was laying to rest an entire past, and that's where her story starts to pull us in. Like a whirlwind of real-life experiences we pretend not to feel, but do. Because who hasn't gotten attached to something or someone in an inexplicable way? Who hasn't lived a phase where the symbolic spoke louder than the real? Yeah, and if you think you know where this story is going, you'd better get ready. What comes next will make you question everything. Sarah was never the type to dream of a white dress, a perfectly decorated nursery, or a photo album filled with baby milestones. Her life was different. Work, bills, disappointing relationships, and time. Oh, time shows no mercy. One day she looked around, 54 years old, a quiet house, and a heart still beating for something she'd never experienced. Motherhood? She chuckled just thinking about it. That ship had sailed, and didn't even wave goodbye. But it's funny how symbolic motherhood finds space where biological motherhood no longer fits. For her, that space came out of nowhere, during a casual chat with a friend who collected lifelike dolls. "Have you ever heard of a reborn baby?" her friend asked. Sarah laughed but couldn't shake it off. Days later, she found herself watching videos online. Stories with reborn babies, women like her, emotional confessions, symbolic losses being treated with quiet affection. Maybe it was loneliness, maybe hope. But she clicked. She chose a model that looked like the child she had only dreamed of as a girl. Closed eyes, rosy cheeks, the weight of a newborn. It stirred something in her, something strange, like a part of her long asleep had been touched. It wasn't an impulse buy. It was a heart's request. And there she was, alone in the kitchen, opening the box. Sarah felt something she hadn't felt in years, anticipation. It wasn't about the doll itself, it was about her, about the woman who still existed behind the wrinkles, the bills, the unspoken goodbyes. The woman who maybe, just maybe, still had love to give and courage to begin again. It was a quiet rebirth, intimate but powerful. You might think, it's strange, she thought so too, but at that moment what once seemed impossible started to take shape. Not as a late pregnancy or some wild plan, but as a single thought. What if there's still time? That small thought would be her turning point. Because sometimes all a woman needs is permission to dream again. Most people, when they hear about an adult woman buying a reborn baby, throw out a snide comment. That's for people who are way too needy. But if you look just a little closer, just a bit of empathy, you'll realize there's a story behind that gesture. And in Sarah's case, it was a mix of loneliness and bottled-up affection. It wasn't just neediness. It was a quiet, longing to feel something that was hers alone. Buying a realistic reborn doll wasn't an escape. It was almost a rescue mission, like finding an old box of letters in the attic and choosing to read each one, knowing it might hurt. And it did. Hurt. Because with that baby came memories of everything she didn't live. The child who never came. The pregnancy that never happened. The nursery that was never decorated. It wasn't madness. It was pure humanity. A way of touching the invisible. To most people, it would be just an object. But to Sarah, that doll became a symbol of healing. And no, she didn't always treat it like it was real. She knew it was a doll, but its value was different. It was what it represented. A point of connection to feelings adulthood had buried. The emotional motherhood that never had a chance to bloom had found its way out, even if through a toy, the fee. Most interesting part? She wasn't looking for reborn therapy. She didn't even know it existed, but that's exactly what happened. A transformative experience, the kind no one plans, but the soul deeply needs. The reborn baby became an emotional mirror, a way for Sarah to reconnect with parts of herself she didn't even remember existed. Attachment theory explains a lot, but living it firsthand is something else entirely. And so, what started as a curious purchase turned into a powerful narrative. Sarah, this strong, real woman, was rediscovering feminine emotions that had been locked away in some dark corner of her soul. All because of a doll, a comfort object, yes, but also the first step in a journey that would completely change how she saw herself and the world around her. Sarah didn't know exactly what she was looking for, but she knew very well what she was feeling. A heavy silence, almost deafening, that lingered through long nights. And when that reborn baby arrived, she had no idea that the emptiness would begin to fill. Not with words, but with presence. Yes, it was a doll. But in those first few days, it was more present than many real people who'd passed through her life. There are things we don't tell anyone. And Sarah began to realize she had been holding in a lot. All those emotional confessions, never heard, now found space in small gestures, putting on a cap, adjusting a blanket, softly humming a tune. The connection with objects may seem strange to those who've never needed it, but anyone who's truly faced loneliness knows, even a pillow can be a confidant. Imagine then a baby in your arms. Each day she felt closer to it, and further from the cold, practical version of herself that adult life had demanded. That's when the doll stopped being just company. It became comfort, a symbol of everything. Denied, suppressed, postponed. And in that symbolic motherhood, Sarah finally felt seen. By herself. No judgment, no deadlines. No need to prove anything to anyone. But the most beautiful and also the most painful moment was when that comfort began to squeeze. You know when a good hug becomes a cage, when comfort starts to suffocate. That's when Sarah understood. What was once a safe harbor had become an anchor. Emotional liberation didn't come with anger or haste. It came with a lump in her throat and a deep sigh. Because sometimes to let go, we need even more love. And in that moment, she started to wonder, was this all just a rehearsal for something greater? Was this emotional attachment to objects just the first step towards something deeper? She didn't know the answers, but for the first time in a long time, she felt she was finally ready to ask the right questions. Every night, Sarah followed a near-sacred ritual. She chose an outfit, straightened the baby blanket, cradled the reborn baby in her arms, and sat in the chair by the window. There, in the silence, she whispered words she never had anyone to say them to. "Mommy's here, okay?" A simple phrase, but one that came out heavy with emotion. It wasn't about believing he was real. It was about feeling she was still capable of loving, even if it was a quiet kind of love. Dressing that baby wasn't play, it was care. It was a gesture that carried something ancestral, almost instinctive. And strange as it may sound, Sarah felt more alive in those moments than she had in years of going through the motions. Who hasn't looked at an object and given it deep meaning? A photo, a ring, or in her case, a realistic reborn doll. That's where her heart found reason to beat a little lighter. Rocking a baby that doesn't breathe might seem insane to some, but to her it was almost therapeutic. Like rocking her own wounds. Emotional motherhood, even without a real child, emerged through tiny gestures, invisible to others, but massive inside her. And that alone was already an act of emotional resilience, a way to bring order to the chaos time had left behind. And the most beautiful part? There was no shame. Sarah didn't hide the doll. On the contrary, it had a place of honor in her home, a constant reminder that she still had maternal affection inside her, even if the world tried to say otherwise. It was a symbol of healing, of an intimate process that didn't need to be understood by anyone else, just felt. What Sarah didn't know yet was that the more she cared for that symbolic baby, the more she was caring for herself. And slowly, that small gesture of affection would begin to make space for a new kind of gaze, one that would come from the outside, but would touch precisely what she was already rediscovering within. Over time, Sarah realized there was a very thin line between what she felt emotionally and what was just symbolic, and she walked that line with delicate balance, knowing that one wrong step could hurt. No, she didn't think the reborn baby was real, but what it awakened in her, that was very real. That's where the so-called therapeutic fantasy lived. Not one that deceives, but one that embraces without denial. Some people hold onto old photo albums. Others keep clothes from loved ones long gone. Sarah held onto a doll, and that emotional attachment, however hard to explain, was part of an inner healing journey no one saw, but she felt it in every move. Yes, it was symbolic motherhood, but it was also emotional reconstruction, a way of filling the gaps time had carved without permission. The line between reality and fantasy isn't always dangerous. Sometimes it's the bridge. And for Sarah, that bridge needed to exist. She didn't pretend to be a mother. She felt what it would be like, and that's a profound difference. It wasn't about illusion. It was about accessing what was buried deep inside, under layers of routine, pain, and silence. It was a kind of reborn therapy, born from instinct, not a manual. The interesting part is, the more she allowed herself to live that reality, the clearer the line became. She knew exactly what she was doing. She knew she couldn't cling to it forever, but she also knew she couldn't ignore what was surfacing. Emotional truth can't be measured with a ruler. It shows up in the pauses, in the small things, in how the heart reacts to the unexpected. And Sarah was paying attention to all of it. Maybe that's why little by little the doll's presence began to shift. What had once been constant companionship became occasional presence. Not because the love had faded, but because the need for it had started to give way. Like a mother who feels her child growing in her arms and knows with a tight chest that soon he'll walk on his own. No one imagined that the reborn baby would trigger something so deep, but it did. Slowly, Sarah began to realize it wasn't just her maternal instinct awakening. It was all of her, The woman who had stayed silent for years, who lived on autopilot, now looked in the mirror with more alert eyes. Not because time had stopped, but because it finally made sense. For the first time in a long time, she wanted to live with intention. It was as if the doll had pulled Sarah out of survival mode. That quiet state where you just go through the motions. Wake up, work, clean, sleep, repeat. But now, she listened. To music again. Cooked for herself with joy. Wore clothes she used to think were unnecessary, and even painted her nails red. Red. Something she hadn't done since her early 30s. Small details loaded with meaning. And the most curious thing. She started dreaming again, literally. She had dreams where she held a real baby, smiled in a park, laughed with someone by her side. And when she woke up, she didn't feel sadness. She felt desire. As if each detail in those dreams was a reminder of what could still happen. What started as emotional attachment to an object was now expanding inside her, like a root-finding, fertile soil. Sarah started going out again. First, short walks, then catching up with friends she herself had distanced from. And in those moments, she caught herself laughing, really laughing, as if the tired, faded version of her had only been temporary. Because deep down, she had never stopped existing. She had just been tucked away, waiting for a signal, and that signal came in the most unexpected form, a doll that didn't cry, but stirred everything inside her. That awakening brought questions, desires, and butterflies in her stomach. Like a teenager again, you know. But there she was, Sarah at 54 with her heart beating faster, not because of anyone else, but because of herself. And little did she know that new sparkle in her eyes would catch the attention of someone who would change everything. Some people believe that after 50 women disappear, that they become invisible, that anything new, intense, or exciting is reserved for the younger ones. Sarah believed that too, for a while. But there, alone with her reborn baby in her arms, she felt an energy rising inside her that hadn't stirred in years. It wasn't a loud revolution, it was subtle, like a flower blooming without an audience. An emotional rebirth that came from the inside out. She started taking better care of herself. Put on lipstick just to go to the bakery, combed her hair even with nowhere to go. What once seemed like vanity was now affirmation. It was as if every small gesture reminded her, "You're still here, Sarah." And she was. Stronger, more sensitive, more present. The realistic reborn doll, once a symbol of emotional motherhood, now represented something even greater, the return of self-love. She caught herself smiling for no reason. Not because of someone else, but because she felt beautiful. And it wasn't about looks, it was about vitality. Feeling alive even with the weight of years' stories and traumas. It's a hard sensation to describe, but easy to recognize in someone who's lived it. She didn't want to look younger. She wanted to look like herself. But finally awake, after years of just enduring. And once again, the reborn baby was there, silent, witnessing it all. The symbolic motherhood she had with him had no rules, no expiration date. It was hers, period. And that gave her an emotional freedom few women experience. She no longer had to mold herself to what others expected. For the first time in a long, well, she was enough. And that, at any age, is liberating. What's most impressive is how during this entire process, people's gaze began to shift too. Friends noticed the sparkle in her eyes. Neighbors started conversations. Strangers complimented her at the grocery store. But it was one particular gaze, one in particular, that made Sarah's heart skip like a teenager's again. What no one expected, not even Sarah, was that the reborn baby had unintentionally prepared the ground for something she thought was long gone. Love. But not just any love. A real one. The kind with fresh coffee in the morning, soft talk on the couch, and easy laughter at the end of the day. And the curious part? Before he appeared, Sarah had to fall in love with herself first. It was in that inner healing that she became someone ready to receive love again. She wasn't looking, didn't sign up for apps, didn't ask friends to set her up. The man showed up at the pharmacy line and was, believe it or not, a random bump, a shared glance, and just like that, a conversation about blood pressure and aging. The charm was in the simplicity, but what caught his attention wasn't the smile, it was the aliveness in the way she expressed herself. That glow only someone truly awakening carries in their eyes. Sarah didn't tell him about the reborn baby right away, not out of shame. It just wasn't the time. But over time, when coffees turned into dinners and the silences started to feel safe, she told him everything. And his reaction? Not laughter, not judgment. He listened, he understood, and the most beautiful thing, he respected it, said he'd never met anyone so genuine, and honestly, he thought it was beautiful how she found such a pure way to heal a pain the world usually hides. The doll, once sleeping beside her bed, began to find other places, physically and symbolically. It now represented a phase, an important step. But Sarah had already moved to another floor, and that didn't make what she lived any less valuable. It just made its meaning even greater, because she understood. The emotional bond with objects had, in truth, been the perfect rehearsal for opening herself to a bond with a real person. And it was at exactly that point in the story that Sarah found herself thinking, what if? That question she thought she'd never ask again. What if there's still time? What if I can still experience something even greater? What if the dream of truly becoming a mother hasn't passed, just been delayed? His name was James. He was 57, spoke with a calm tone, and had that look of someone who listens with his heart. When he met Sarah, he didn't see wrinkles, he saw presence. He didn't see a 54-year-old woman, but someone with a different kind of light, like she had just rediscovered herself. And she had. He just didn't know yet how recent that light was, and how hard-earned it had been, with scars and long conversations with herself. James was the kind of man who noticed the pauses in the middle of sentences. He wasn't in a rush. He was the opposite of what Sarah had known before. Rushed relationships, based on appearances or emotional absence. With him, she could breathe slowly, without fear of being too much or feeling too deeply. And for a woman who had spent years holding herself back, that was gold. The freedom to be whole, without apologizing. It was with him that Sarah told, for the first time, the full story of the reborn baby. She thought he would find it strange, maybe even dodge the topic, but he didn't. James sat in silence, looking into her eyes. Then he held her hand and said, "That just shows how much love you have inside you," Sarah cried, and he stayed right there, steady, present, without correcting her, without minimizing anything, just holding space. He understood that her symbolic motherhood wasn't madness, it was expression. And more than that, he saw it as strength, not weakness. He said many people carry invisible pain and don't have the courage to face it. Sarah did, in her own way, with a doll, with affection, with small gestures. But she did. And to him, that was one of the most beautiful things he had ever seen in a woman. The bond between them grew quickly but with deep roots. And maybe right there she realized something even more delicate. James wasn't just a new love. He was living proof that emotional truth, when shared with someone who deserves it, doesn't scare. It frees. And with that freedom, Sarah began to allow herself to make plans that, until then, had felt forbidden. What if there's still time? That question echoed in Sarah's mind one ordinary late afternoon, as she folded a little blanket she'd used so many times with the reborn baby. It came like an inner whisper, the kind you pretend not to hear at first, but that keeps insisting. At 54, Sarah had never imagined she'd think about real motherhood again. She had said goodbye to that dream many times in many ways. But now, it came back with a different tone. Possible. What surprised her most was that this thought didn't come with desperation, nor with that suffocating urgency. It was gentle, like a mature kind of hope. A quiet yet firm desire, as if her body said, "Wait," but her heart replied, "Go." It was a strange and sweet feeling all at once, because for the first time, she didn't feel ashamed of wanting it to be a mother. Not symbolic, not emotional, a real mother. Of course, doubts came, her age, judgment, risks. Society shouts loudly in moments like these, right? But James, with his calm demeanor, looked at her one day and said, "If you want, we can try." That both chilled and warmed her at the same time. It was a mix of fear and joy she hadn't felt since her youth. And then she understood. Just allowing herself to dream again was already a victory. That question, what if there's still time, became fuel. Sarah began researching, talking to doctors, understanding her body, her fertility, the yogi. Possible paths. It wasn't about rushing. It was about having the right to still want, to still build, to still give herself permission to try. And that's something many women silence inside, afraid of seeming ridiculous. But there was Sarah, breaking yet another taboo with courage and tenderness. And so, while the world insisted that 54 meant the end of the road, she responded with plans, quickened heartbeats, and a new sparkle in her eyes. What if there's still time? What if it's possible? What if... That question kept echoing inside her. And Sarah had no idea she was about to ask even deeper, even more liberating questions. Talking about wanting to have a child after 50 still scares many people. It seems too bold, out of place, even irresponsible in others' eyes. But no one asks why. No one stops to consider the courage it takes to desire something the world says no longer belongs to you. Sarah knew that. She felt it in sideways glances, in questions disguised as concern, in offhanded comments like, "But at your age, why?" The answer: because she felt it, because she could, because it was hers. Wanting a child after 50 wasn't a whim. It was an extension of the symbolic motherhood that had lived inside her for so long. It was the same feeling she had projected onto the reborn doll, now pulsing with a different intensity. It was maternal affection, overflowing, searching for a way to be lived more tangibly, more real, and there was nothing selfish about it. On the contrary, it was pure love, a love that refused to stay just memory or fantasy. Of course she was afraid. She doubted herself, felt ridiculous at times. After all, we've been conditioned to believe that women have an expiration date for certain desires. But when Sarah looked within, what she saw wasn't an old woman chasing youth. It was a strong, conscious woman who knew what she wanted and was willing to fight for it with dignity. That's not taboo. That's courage. She read stories from other women, saw tales of reborn dolls turning into real babies. She met mothers who got pregnant at 50, 52, even 56. Not all of them succeeded, it's true. But they all said the same thing. Trying was liberating. And Sarah understood that the final result isn't always what matters most. Sometimes just the act of wanting breaks an entire cycle of silence and shame, and in that new chapter, Sarah felt more alive than ever. The reborn baby, which once filled a void, was now a reminder of an awakening. And more than ever, she wanted to move forward. Not as someone defying the world, but as someone finally listening to her own heart. And that heart was quietly beginning to prepare for the farewell that was soon to come. Letting go isn't about forgetting. It never was. And Sarah had learned that in the most delicate yet most intense way. She reached a point where the reborn doll, which had once been a cradle, had become a mirror. She no longer rocked it as often, no longer felt that ache when it wasn't nearby, but still the simple idea of putting it away hurt. Because it wasn't just a doll. It was everything it represented. We hold on to symbols because they tell parts of our story that words can't. The reborn baby wasn't just a hyper-realistic doll. It was the bridge between the woman Sarah was and the woman who was being reborn. So saying goodbye to it didn't feel like betrayal. It felt like a ceremony, a rite of passage, because letting go of the past takes more love than clinging to what once was. It takes accepting that you've changed. That's when Sarah realized that letting go is an act of self-love. It's telling yourself, I honor what I've lived, but I don't have to carry it forever. And that's hard, because often attachment gives us a false sense of safety. But over time, Sarah came to understand that true love also knows how to release. And the past, however important it may have been, doesn't define what's still to come. She began preparing to put the doll away calmly, almost like someone preparing a farewell for someone deeply loved. She washed the little clothes, folded, the blankets, arranged everything neatly. It was more than organization, it was care, it was gratitude, because that comforting object had given her the greatest gift, a reunion with herself. And now she needed to let it rest. But even with all that in mind, something still weighed on her chest, because no matter how prepared we are, farewells have their own timing. And Sarah was about to live through that time, a time that doesn't ask for speed, but for surrender. And on that day, as she opened the bottom drawer of the wardrobe, something inside her began to say, "It's time." It was an ordinary afternoon, with a cloudy sky and the smell of coffee in the air. Sarah hadn't planned for that to be the day, but some moments announced themselves, even in silence. She looked at the reborn baby lying on the armchair, just how she always left it, and felt something different. A good kind of ache, you know, a kind of early nostalgia, as if she knew something needed to be lovingly brought to an end. She picked it up gently, as she always did, but this time it wasn't automatic. It was solemn, as if each movement said, "Thank you." She rocked it slowly, in a rhythm that felt like goodbye. Her fingers trembled a little, and in the back of her eyes, a quiet glimmer. She tried not to let fall. The reborn doll seemed lighter, or maybe she was stronger. That gentle strength that's born when you choose to move forward, even with your heart aching. As she rocked it, a part of her replayed everything she had lived. The days of solitude and affection, the silent comfort, the emotional outbursts. Only that doll had heard. It was like watching her own story in slow motion, and it wasn't sadness she felt, it was gratitude, a kind of melancholy peace that appears when you realize you've lived something beautiful, but that has already served its purpose. A blue blanket on top, she adjusted the little folds of the clothing and kissed the cold forehead. "You helped me find my way back to myself," she whispered. It was the purest form of emotional farewell. There was no shame, no denial. There was love. Mature, deep love. The kind that knows loving also means knowing when it's time to let go. And then, with steady hands and a trembling heart, she walked over to the wardrobe. The drawer was empty, ready, and the act of placing the doll inside was quick, but it echoed inside her like a silent thunder, a kind of symbolic loss only. Those who've lived it can understand. But as she closed the drawer, Sarah took a deep breath, and there, between the final touch and the click of the wood, the first step of a new path was born. Putting the reborn baby away wasn't just closing a drawer. It was ending a cycle filled with meaning, pain, inner reunions, and healing silences. Sarah knew that moment would come, but she didn't imagine how profound it would be. It was as if, by saying goodbye to that doll, she was also saying goodbye to the woman she had been for so long, that woman who lived in fear, who swallowed her feelings, who hid behind routine. The farewell wasn't made of dramatic tears. It was made of a heavy and respectful silence. Sarah spent the rest of the day in a kind of trance. Every object she looked at in the house seemed to carry new meaning. She was undergoing emotional reconstruction, the kind of process you can't share with everyone because it's too intimate. But those who've formed emotional bonds with objects know they hold more than memories. They hold pieces of us. It was that day she realized how much she had changed. The reborn baby had been a symbol of healing she needed at the right moment. But now it no longer fit. The emotional dependency she had developed at the beginning no longer made sense. The woman she used to be needed that symbolic embrace. But the woman she is now stands on her own. She still feels, she still gets emotional, but now she walks with lightness. It's funny how certain rituals help us leave the past where it belongs. Putting the doll away was indeed a way to bury the past, but not with sadness, with honor. Like someone saying, "Thank you for getting me this far, but now I'm going alone." And it's not easy, you know, because even what heals us can become a crutch if we don't know when to let go. And so, with that mix of peace and emptiness, Sarah began a new chapter. Because when we create space within ourselves, life takes care of filling it. And it was in that freshly cleared space between longing and freedom that something new began to approach, lighter, freer, more real. When she closed the drawer where she placed the reborn doll, Sarah understood without needing to say it out loud. that it wasn't just the doll she was leaving behind. It was as if she had packed away, along with that hyper-realistic baby doll, all the weight she had carried for decades. The fear of not being loved, the pain of everything she didn't live, the loneliness layered in invisible folds. All of it, which had no name, now had a form. And it was being put away with respect. We don't always realize what we're carrying until the moment we choose to put it down. And when Sarah put that baby away, the relief was physical. She breathed deeper, her spine felt lighter. It was as if her entire body understood. It's over. That version of her, the one that needed symbolic comfort every day, was now making way for another, more whole, more prepared. What stayed in the box was symbolic, but real as a scar. And don't think it was easy. Fear still whispered, "What if you regret this? What if this new phase isn't as good as the old one?" But she chose to trust, because burying the past isn't about discarding it. It's about giving it a dignified ending so that it doesn't haunt the present. And there, in that little corner of the wardrobe, she also placed a symbolic farewell to the pain she carried without even knowing. The loneliness she had lived with for years didn't disappear overnight, but it gained a new name, past. And that changes everything. Sarah was now a real woman at peace with her story, and that showed in the way she walked, spoke, even in how she took up space. The emotional motherhood she lived through that doll wasn't in vain. It was the portal to everything that would come after, including new connections, new dreams, even new possibilities she hadn't dared to name. And it was precisely when that sense of liberation settled in that Sarah felt she was ready, not to go back in time, not to replace anything, but to live from now on without needing shields. And she had no idea that this openness would bring one of the deepest decisions of her life. The word kill might sound harsh, even aggressive, but for Sarah, it was liberating. Killing the reborn baby didn't mean destruction. It meant closure. It meant letting go of something that had been essential, but now occupied a space that needed to be filled with something new. It was like stopping rehearsals and finally stepping onto the stage. The dream that had once been symbolic, secret, now came into the light. She wanted to truly live the experience of motherhood. Yes, she still wanted to be a mother. It wasn't an impulsive decision. Sarah thought about it, felt it, weighed the risks, but the desire was greater than the fear. She knew the reborn baby had been a kind of mirror for her emotions, a reflection of everything that had been stored away. But now she wanted to look into the eyes of someone alive, real, born, from her body or not, because the new dream wasn't tied to a form. It came filled with emotional truth and an enormous dose of courage. Killing the reborn was an act of love. Love for herself, for everything she had lived up to that point, and also for everything she still wanted to live. It was the start of a deeper, more challenging emotional rebuilding process, but at the same time more real. Now there were no more shields, no more symbols, no more simulations. Just the desire to live what for so long she thought was impossible. Sarah began exploring options she had never considered before: late adoption, fertility treatments, even support groups for women who wanted to be mothers after 50. And believe it or not, she wasn't alone. She found strong, real women who also carried that dormant flame inside them. The reborn baby, which had once been her only emotional outlet, was now the starting point for something even greater, something alive. And that's how she began to transform symbolic loss into emotional rebirth. The drawer with the doll remained closed, but Sarah's heart was more open than ever, because sometimes we have to bury what comforts us to make space for what transforms us. And she was about to discover what that really meant in practice. The farewell to the reborn baby wasn't just the end of one chapter, it was the beginning of an entirely new one. Sarah went through a symbolic grief that many wouldn't understand, but to her, that doll carried affection, pain, even unfulfilled dreams. So when she decided to let go, she experienced a real kind of loss. She cried, she went quiet, she spent days processing it all, but soon she realized what seemed like an end was actually a rebirth, a new life, without weight, without illusion, without shame in wanting more. That rebirth didn't come with fireworks or motivational speeches. It came in daily life, in the small choices she started making more consciously. She began saying yes to things she used to avoid, like making new plans, expressing her desires, even imagining building a new family. She felt that, emotionally, she was rebuilding herself on a firmer foundation. She no longer needed a symbol to remember who she was. She knew. The process was intense, but deeply true. Sarah began to care for herself with a different outlook. She cared for her body with respect, her mind with patience, and her heart with generosity. And that drew to her what she both feared and desired the most: change. Not just any change, but the kind that transforms from within, the kind you feel in your bones. It was as if she was being reborn, only this time by choice. Many women live stories like this, but don't share them, out of shame, out of fear of judgment. But Sarah wanted to speak, not to show off, but so others could see themselves in her journey. Because deep down, this is the kind of path that touches on something universal, the desire to start over, even when the world says it's too late. And when a woman dares to be reborn, she doesn't go back to who she was. She becomes who she always wanted to be. And it was in this new internal space that Sarah began to glimpse possibilities that once seemed far away. Not just motherhood, but a new way of living, a new way of loving, of relating, of existing. And this new version of her, more whole, more free, still had so much to teach and so much to live. Closing the chapter of the reborn baby was like opening a window after years with the curtains drawn. Sarah felt the wind of change coming through the house and through her soul. The end of that bond didn't erase what she had lived. On the contrary, it honored every detail. But now, she was ready for something different. And the most interesting part. This new life that was approaching wasn't perfect or predictable. It was real, full of nuance and honest new beginnings. With James by her side, Sarah began experiencing a new daily life. It was made of light exchanges, comfortable silences, and plans built together. They talked about children, yes, but also about traveling, projects, even courses she had always wanted to take but never had time for. The reborn baby, which had once been everything she had, was now a beautiful memory. Real life was calling, and she was answering with both feet on the ground and an open heart. This new life didn't require Sarah to forget the past. On the contrary, it was the foundation upon which she was building her present. But now she occupied a new emotional space, lighter, more conscious, more free. The connection she once had with objects had given way to an even stronger connection with herself and with the world around her. And that change wasn't visible to the eyes. It was felt in the way she breathed, smiled, moved. It's hard to explain to anyone who hasn't been through something similar, but when we close a chapter with truth, life responds. New opportunities appear, new people show up, and time, once an enemy, becomes an ally. Sarah began living days that seemed small but in truth were immense, because for the first time everything she felt was valid, and nothing had to be hidden anymore. That's how the space left by the doll was, slowly filled with new experiences, new bonds, and even new possibilities she hadn't yet allowed herself to dream about out loud. And in that quiet transition, the sentence that had once seemed absurd began to make more and more sense. When Sarah first said, "I killed my reborn baby," many people frowned, widened their eyes, or let out a nervous laugh. The phrase, by itself, sounds harsh, almost cruel. But to her it was the exact opposite. It was liberation. It was the most direct and honest way to say she had closed a chapter that, for a long time, had been necessary. It was like tearing off a label, opening a door, finally taking a deep breath after years of holding it in. Sarah didn't kill a doll. She freed a part of herself. That unsettling phrase actually holds one of the most moving stories of womanhood you'll ever hear, because it's not about the doll, it's about everything it represented. Emotional. Motherhood, loneliness, emotional attachment, healing, rebuilding, and above all, a kind of love that needed room to reinvent itself. The reborn baby was the means, not the end, a symbol of healing, a mirror of emotions that, when they couldn't be put into words, found form in vinyl. Sarah isn't ashamed of what she lived through. In fact, she's proud, because it was on that unlikely path that she rediscovered herself as a woman, as a human being, as someone who could still dream. And when she put that doll away, she didn't erase anything. She just turned the page and left the story written in her gestures, her choices in a gaze that was now firmer yet lighter. The woman who said, "I killed my reborn baby," is the same woman who said, "I came back to life." Stories like this, raw, powerful, rarely get space, because they make people uncomfortable. They break expectations. They show that women's mental health isn't about Instagram quotes or neatly packaged advice. They show the raw, vulnerable, and also beautiful side of when an object becomes a turning point. Sarah lived through a transformative experience, and she doesn't need everyone to understand. But those who felt something similar will feel it, will relate, and maybe will find strength to begin again. And deep down, that phrase people judge so harshly is actually an invitation, a call to look inward, to revisit your own stored-away boxes, your emotional drawers, your hidden attachments. Because sometimes, to make space for the new life we so badly want, we need the courage to bury what has already served its purpose. Even if that something was everything to you for a while, we spend our whole lives trying to be strong, pretending. We don't feel, don't need that everything's fine, but there comes a moment when the soul asks for a pause and truth. Sarah's story is about that, about listening to what no one sees, feeling what no one validates, and having the courage to turn pain into a beginning. She didn't kill a doll. She let go of an old version of herself to make space for the life she truly wanted to live. And you? What haven't you been able to say goodbye to? What part of you is still stored in an emotional drawer, waiting to be set free? This video isn't just about reborn babies, it's about me. It's about you. About all the strong, real women who keep going with hearts full of memories, but with the will to continue, despite it all. Share in the comments. What was the symbol that helped you move forward? Or better yet, what do you need to lay to, rest in order to truly begin again? Your story might touch someone else just as this one touched you now. And together, we build a safe space where vulnerability is strength, not weakness. If this video moved you, don't keep it to yourself. Send it to someone who needs to hear it today. It might be the spark that awakens something powerful in another soul. And of course, tell me what you thought, if this story resonates with you, and what other topics you'd like to see here. Oh, and don't forget, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because there are still so many stories that need to be told. And who knows, maybe the next one will be yours.